So, welcome again, and welcome to this ISBNPA webinar. I'm Jeroen Lakerveld, and I will give a very brief introduction and some housekeeping, so to run the webinar as efficient as possible. And at the International Society of Behavioral Nutrition and Physical Activity, we are very delighted that we can organize these webinars as an extra service to our members. And this webinar is organized by the Special Interest Group Policies and Environments. You can see a full list of special interest groups and how to join them on our website. And today we are using Zoom. This is a system. And in this system you are all muted, so you cannot talk, except for the speakers and organizers. And this prevents noise and keeps us concentrated on the actual talk. So, however, we would like to give you the ability to interact and ask questions and to make comments. On this slide, you see that there are more webinars and recordings on the ISBNPA website, which is isbnpa.org, but I think you all know that. Asking questions and comments that can be done using the Q&A button you see on your screen. You can ask and type in questions during the webinar, but they will be addressed only after the presentation has been given. And we will aggregate the comments and at the end of the talk, ask the questions on behalf of the audience. So feel free to ask questions along the way, and I think we are not with that many that there's a great chance that your questions are going to be posed later. So finally, also note that there's a full screen mode. If you click on that icon, you can enter that mode. And from our experience, this is the most convenient way of enjoying the webinar. So now I will give the floor to Dr. Andrew Rundle. Very delighted that he was willing to provide a webinar. And at the Columbia University, his research focuses on the determinants of sedentary lifestyles and obesity and the health-related consequences of these conditions. He co-directs the Built Environment and Health Research Group. That's a team of researchers studying on how neighborhood built and social environments as well influences health, and particularly physical activity and obesity risk. So in this webinar, he will talk about urban informatics. Very curious to hear about that, and he will provide an example from New York. So without further ado, I will ask Andrew to share his screen, and we will switch to his presentation. Andrew, it's over to you. Go ahead.
Hello. Thank you all for joining the webinar and taking the time to listen to me and see this presentation. I'm Andrew Rundle. I'm an associate professor of epidemiology at the Mailman School of Public Health, and I'm going to be talking to you about some of the research we're doing here that we've been sort of thinking about in terms of or describing as urban informatics. To start, this is the most recent obesity map for the US. And so what you can see here is we've got a really significant obesity epidemic with basically all of the states showing above 20% prevalence of obesity. Many of our states above 30%, and a handful of our states above 35%. It's generally thought that these data are the underestimate of actually what is going on, because this is based on self-report telephone surveys. Similar surveys have looked at the percent of people who are engaged in physical activity to the extent that they're meeting our physical activity recommendations. And so only about 20% of US adults currently meet health-based physical activity recommendations. So we have both an epidemic of sedentary lifestyles and, as you would expect, correlated with that, an epidemic of obesity. And this has really got significant public health costs. Obesity causes hypertension, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, stroke, and at the last report, 13 forms of cancer. Physical activity prevents colon and breast cancer even after you account for differences in body size. And even modest improvements in BMI cause improvements in blood pressure, lipids, and fasting blood sugar. So there is hope that this can be reversed. And one of my interests is understanding how what the determinants are of sedentary lifestyles and lack of physical activity. And as I said, we've been sort of formalizing our ideas of how we approach research or tackle research under the banner of urban informatics. And our ideas are that urban areas are centers of just absolutely intense data production. But until relatively recently, much of this data was either locked up and sequestered away in government agencies or for-profit businesses, or it was just completely ambient and nearly impossible to tap into and organize and utilize. But over the past 10 years, this has been changing. There have been major innovations in information technology. We've had changes here in the States around open government initiatives where government agencies are putting their data online. The rise of social media has provided new advents or new ways to gather data, as have crowdsourcing and Mechanical Turk applications as ways of gathering data. And then as more and more data is going onto the web, we can build web scraping tools to scrape this data from the web. And so the information is becoming much, much more accessible. In addition, the costs of creating data are falling, again, because of the innovations in information technology. And to the left, you sort of see a visualization. Because we use a lot of GIS tools, we visualize data that describes urban spaces as layers of information that can be stacked, and that information can be then abstracted across layers or joined through layers by virtue of the spatial orientation of the information. And so formally, we're arguing that urban informatics is the tapping into an organization and analysis of the massive data effluent that is produced by urban centers. And much of what we utilize this data for is to measure exposures to pollutants, built social and cultural environments, economic stressors, and medical infrastructure. And a lot of what we do is really around using this information to characterize the neighborhoods within which people live, play, work, or learn. And in the US, there was a recent document that referred to Public Health 3.0 that had a series of recommendations. And one of those recommendations was that timely, reliable, granular level data and actionable data should be made accessible to communities throughout the country. And this section of Public Health 3.0 was really around informatics to the provision of data. And so our frame is that to understand exposures, to understand context, we are going to use all of this recently readily available data. So the case study that we've been working on, or one of the case studies that I'll share with you now, is understanding how urban design promotes physical activity. And a lot of these ideas originated in the urban planning literature. And urban planners talk about a notion of neighborhood walkability. And neighborhood walkability is a set of urban form characteristics that supports and promotes engagement in pedestrian activity. And planners often talk about the Ds. So this is the density of people, the density of destinations, the density of public transit stops. They talk about diversity, so the diversity of land uses, this idea that there's a mixing of recreational, residential, commercial, institutional land uses all within one neighborhood. And then they talk about design. So the biggest feature of design that they talk about in this literature relates to street network design. And so on the upper left here, there's a screenshot of from Street View of a highly walkable neighborhood in New York City, and it's characterized by sidewalks, and lots of people using the sidewalks. Very high population density. You can see that with the big apartment buildings. High land use mix, all the ground floor business establishments. And then in the lower left, we have a screenshot from Queens, which is part of New York City. And this would be a very low walkability neighborhood. The first thing you notice is there are no sidewalks and actually nobody out walking. The population density is low. It's all single family homes. Every house has got a driveway with a car. So clearly this is a residential environment, which is very car dependent. And when you think about it, the types of ideas that planners have been talking about in the the walkability literature really relate to what you can see if you were to look at Google Maps. So in the top frame, you see a high walkable area in Midtown Manhattan. It's got a gridded network. It's got lots of large buildings, large apartment buildings. You can see all of the transit possibilities, and you can see all the diversity of businesses and land uses. And then again, in the bottom, this is actually also a shot from Queens. And what you see is, again, single family homes, low density, kind of a strange street network. It's hard to get around. And there's only one business really, Amy's Balloons. And so if you needed to get some balloons, you were all set. You could walk to Amy's. But if you needed anything else for your daily life, you're basically going to have to drive. Whereas in the top shot, most of what you need for your daily living is accessible to you by just walking to go get it. And so on the right, we have a map of New York City color-coded by walkability using a measure that we've created here that builds upon the work of Lawrence Frank and the ideas from urban planning. And so what you see here is the measure of neighborhood walkability for every single census block in New York City, color-coded. There are 38,000 census blocks in New York City that we've measured here. And then this measure is composed of 5 sort of sub-measures. So one of them is residential density, and we use the US Census for that. Intersection density, and we're using Esri base maps for that. Land use mix, which is a measure, it's an entropy measure of 5 types of land use. And we actually get this data from what's called NYC Pluto, which is a tax lot data set that provides us with the land use of every square foot of land in New York City. And so we can drill down to the per building, per floor even, uses of land in New York City. And we use this to measure land use mix. Subway stop density is from the NYC map. And then there's a measure called retail building floor area to retail land use, which again utilizes the Pluto data sets. And this is basically this measure indexes the extent to which retail is the kind of retail where you have a strip mall or a parking lot versus the kind of retail where you can step off the sidewalk and there's just street level retail that you can just walk into without having to traverse a parking lot or anything like that. So we have these 5 measures. Each one is Z-scored, and then those Z-scores are summed. And the original paper on this is by Frank, and it's in JAPA in 2006. And then our version is described in 2009. And so this is the measure that we've been using to measure walkability in New York City. And we've been partnering with the New York City Department of Health, who conducted a representative survey of physical activity and travel mode in New York City in 2010. And one of the things they did is a subset of the individuals, 805 individuals, wore a GPS monitor, which captured GPS coordinates every 5 seconds for up to 7 days. And they also wore accelerometers. And what you can see here on the left is the raw GPS data in red on a map of Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn, and you can see the density of the data. There's actually 8.5 million GPS location points. So you can see features such as the Staten Island ferry. So on the left side near Governor's Island, you can see the traces that are produced by people on the ferry. You can see the bridges that connect Brooklyn and Manhattan. And the data is so dense that you can almost make out the whole street grid just from the GPS data. And so we focused really on the residential neighborhood of the study participants. Most work on neighborhood health effects has focused on the residential neighborhood and has used measures like a census tract or a zip code, or when they got more sophisticated, has created radial buffers of 1 kilometer. And so they've characterized study participants' neighborhoods using 1 kilometer sort of circles around the home. And so you can see 4 examples on the right where the gray circle is 1 kilometer around a residence, and then the dots represent the GPS data that fall within that 1 kilometer circle. And then the white strangely shaped polygon is a minimally convex hull that encapsulates the GPS data. So if you ever watched National Geographic or a nature show where they put a GPS tracker on like a wolf or a gazelle or maybe a lion, and then they track that animal, and then they talk about the animal's home range and how big the home range is, what they actually do there is they're using the same methodology. And so we've borrowed a methodology from sort of Nature Conservatory, and we've applied it to New Yorkers so that we can understand how big the home range of an average New Yorker is. So how much space does a New Yorker utilize in a given week in their assumed home neighborhood of 1 kilometer. So what this means is we've created for each of the study participants 3 neighborhood definitions. We've created the residential area within 1 kilometer around the home, the GPS defined area that they actually used within 1 kilometer around the home, and then the area that they could have used within 1 kilometer around the home, but did not actually use at all during the GPS monitoring. So you have the assumed neighborhood of 1 kilometer, radial buffer, the actually used neighborhood area, the area they could have used within 1 kilometer of their home, but they did not use. So one of our first questions was simply, how much space does a New Yorker utilize in their home neighborhood? Turns out that it's actually only on average about 1.38 kilometers squared. So if you think about the typical research that's using a 1 kilometer circle, your typical New Yorker is actually using a lot less space than you would assume based on a 1 kilometer circle. And the other thing we wanted to do is to understand what kinds of neighborhood characteristics in the 1 kilometer circle predicted how much difference there is between individuals and how much space they use. So our first analysis, we looked at homicide rates and median household income. So what I'm showing you here is the difference in area associated in per homicide per 10,000 people, or per $10,000 difference in household income. The red dot is the point estimate, and then we have the confidence intervals, and the red line is the null of no difference. So what we see is that differences in homicide rate and differences in median household income have absolutely basically no association with how much space somebody actually utilizes in their neighborhood. And when we looked at all kinds of sort of social characteristics, income, economic characteristics of the residential neighborhoods, there were no associations actually with differences in how much space people were using. But when we look at these urban design characteristics, we actually see some strong associations. So what we actually see is that the higher the residential density, the less space people use. However, the higher the intersection density, the more space that they use. We see that land use mix has absolutely no association with how much space somebody uses, but retail floor area ratio is significantly associated with greater usage of space. So the more that businesses are at street level that you can just walk into, the more space people actually utilize. And then subway stop density. So the higher the subway stop density, the less space people use. So when you go into a subway, obviously I can't track you by GPS. And so people are basically, when they have lots of access to subway stops, they're actually exiting their neighborhood quicker, or able to exit their neighborhood nearer their home. And so they actually use less residential space. So what we see is that overall, sort of the social context variables have no association with space utilization in the residential neighborhood, but urban design related variables have got significant associations with how much space people utilize. The next thing we're interested in is whether or not people systematically utilize the most walkable areas. So what I've plotted here is the difference in the Walkability Index score for the area that people used versus the area that they could have used but did not use, in both cases within 1 kilometer of their home. And what we find is that the walkability score of the area that people utilize is significantly higher than the walkability score of the areas that they don't use. And again, the red is the point estimate, and the error bars are present there for you. And so what we see, or how we interpret this, is that people are systematically in their residential neighborhoods using the most walkable portions of their neighborhoods and avoiding the least walkable portions of their neighborhoods. And as I said, these individuals who took part in this study also wore an accelerometer, and the accelerometer was worn from 4 to 7 days. And we focused on measuring minutes of moderate and vigorous activity. And because we were partnering with the Department of Health that wanted to be able to relate this data back to health recommendations, we created this measure called moderate equivalent minutes of activity per week. So that's the minutes of moderate activity plus 2 times the minutes of vigorous activity. The idea here is that it takes about twice as much energy to engage in vigorous activity as it does in moderate activity. So we weighted minutes of vigorous activity by a factor of 2. And now we can measure the number of minutes that actually contribute to each person meeting health-based recommendations for physical activity, which in the US are all sort of oriented around gaining minutes of moderate or vigorous activity. So we have accelerometry data from all of the subjects that took part, or actually many of the subjects that took part in this. Some people didn't actually wear it for the full 4 to 7 days. And what I've plotted here is the minutes of moderate equivalent physical activity per week by quartile of walkability. So quartile 1 is the least walkable neighborhood, quartile 4 is the most walkable neighborhood. These results are adjusted for gender, age, race, self-rated health, employment status, neighborhood household income, and homicide rate. And so what you can see is that the minutes of moderate equivalent physical activity are actually quite high in New York City, and they increase significantly across the quartiles of neighborhood walkability. And the difference between the first quartile and the fourth quartile is actually 100 minutes of moderate equivalent physical activity. So given that our current health recommendations are 150 minutes per week, this is actually a very large difference in physical activity between individuals living in the least walkable neighborhood and those living in the most walkable neighborhood. And so the accelerometer was worn all day, and so obviously a lot of this physical activity actually happened outside the residential neighborhood. And what we think part of this is that if you live in a highly walkable neighborhood, you can essentially live a life that is independent of having to use an automobile. And so once you're no longer tied to an automobile, it actually changes your interaction with the city throughout the whole day. So you're not stuck in traffic commuting for extended periods of time each day. You're actually walking throughout the day. And again, so we see this significant and large association between neighborhood walkability and the amount of minutes of activity per week that our participants engaged in. But the challenge here is that this data and so much of the data in the literature is cross-sectional. And what we really need to do is start linking information about neighborhood design and the context of neighborhoods with cohort data where we have repeated measures of physical activity, maybe body mass index and health outcomes for cohorts that have been followed for decades. So we can really see health trajectories. And we can also look at how when a neighborhood changes around a person, that person's behavior changes, or when a person moves from one neighborhood to another and the neighborhoods are quite different, how their behavior changes. But there are some significant challenges to doing this. So we rely a lot on tax lot data, and Lawrence Frank's original version of the measure, which was from Atlanta, also used tax lot data. The difficulty is that tax lot data that gives us information about land use is not collected uniformly, and in many cases not at all across the US. And even when it is collected, it's not available historically. So in New York City, I can go back to about 2000 with this database, but that's it. And then other places around the country, you can't get this data at all. So that's two of the measures within the Walkability Index that are dependent on tax lot data, and it's just not available across large parts of the US, and it's not available backwards through time. In addition, public transit data thus far have not been available historically, and that's one of the measures that we include in our walkability metric. Now, walkscore.com is available nationally using uniform measures, but it's not available historically, so you can't go back 30 years with walkscore.com. And then if you're using their API, there are a lot of privacy issues to consider. We've written an editorial about this in 2016, the American Journal of Public Health. So it's quite challenging to think about a cohort study that has been around for 20 or 30 years and linking neighborhood data to that cohort. So we've been building what we are calling thus far Walkability Index version 2.0, and the goal is to create a walkability measure that can be used across the United States and going back 30 years. So destinations is one of the walkability variables that planners talk about. And in our current measure, land use mix and retail building floor area both relate to the availability of destinations of daily living. If you look at WalkScore, they don't use land use mix in WalkScore, they actually use destinations as one of their measures. So we're moving from using land use mix to using data on the destinations of daily living. And there's a database called the National Establishment Time Series, or NETS data, which is an annual census of all establishments that are present in Dun & Bradstreet database from 1990 onwards. So the NETS data has the January census of every business in Dun & Bradstreet, and that's about 50 million or more different kinds of establishments or businesses. And the database provides SIG coding, and we've spent a lot of time sort of building a coding algorithm so that we can use the standard industry coding to identify destinations that are likely to be relevant to residents in their daily living or weekly living that would serve as destinations that would generate pedestrian trips. And our first publication using NETS was in 2016, where we were just looking at the New York City metropolitan area, and we were looking at county by county the number of businesses where you could engage in vigorous physical activity, and in panel C, the number of large supermarkets. And so we are able to plot trajectories for counties in the New York City metropolitan area for these kinds of businesses using SIG codes. And so we're now expanding this so that we've developed a coding system for destinations of daily living, and we've purchased the data for the entire United States going back to 1990. And then the other thing we wanted to understand is how can we measure public transit? And so in the United States, there is the Center of Transit-Oriented Development, which compiles data on all rail transit stations in the United States. And so what we've done is we've coded for every station the opening and closing dates for each of those stations from 1970 onwards. And so on the right side of your panel, on the right side of the slide is an example. This is a subway line that existed in the Bronx, and it closed in 1973. It's the IRT number 8. And so we've created a database of all rail transit in the United States, subways, light rail, commuter rail, streetcars, with the opening and close dates of all of their stops. So now we have a nationally usable data set of transit stops. And so we're building Walkability 2.0. We're going to use population density, which is going to come from the US Census and the American Community Survey. We're going to use intersection density for the US using the Tiger Street Center lines. Destinations are going to come from the annual NETS data, and rail transit is going to come from the CTOD database that we've worked with. And again, it's the same plan where you calculate z-scores across observations and you sum the z-scores. So our Walkability Index 2.0 is an effort to create a measure that relates to these ideas that have come out of planning around what kinds of characteristics produce physical activity around pedestrian activity. So how are we going to validate this? So the first step is to calculate our original index and our new index for every single census block in New York City using a 1 kilometer buffer around the centroid of the block and just see how well they correlate. The second step is to conduct what we refer to as a cage match, where we are going to compare how each of our walkability measures predicts physical activity using the accelerometer data I've just shown you. So it will be essentially a head-to-head battle between our two walkability indexes to see how well they predict physical activity. And then we're going to go back to 1990, and we've partnered with NYU and their women's health study, and they launched a cohort around women's health with enrollment in 1990, where they collected survey data on walking behavior and BMI, and their recruitment lasted from 86 to 1990. So we're going to try and build the walkability index for 1990 and then see how well it predicts walking behavior and BMI from data collected back then. And then we are going to try and partner with other groups in other cities across the United States that have got accelerometry data and see how well our measure predicts physical activity in those data sets compared to the measures that are currently being used. So I have some results from these activities. Here is just a simple correlation between our original index on the x-axis and our new index on the y-axis. And so the Spearman correlation is 0.86. You can see that there is some variation in the original measure that is not really being picked up at the new measure. So there's variation between 10 and 0 in the in the old measure that isn't really showing any difference in the y axis, which is our new measure. But nonetheless, we have a Spearman correlation of 0.86. Here I'm showing you results from our reanalysis of the accelerometry data. So this is 3 separate models, all predicting the same outcome. And here I'm showing you the percent difference in physical activity for the interquartile range of each of 3 measures of walkability. Each model adjusts for the same covariates. It uses complex survey methods. So it's essentially 3 analyses where the only difference between each analysis is which measure of walkability we've used. So when we looked at the original walkability index, there was about a 30% difference in physical activity across the interquartile range. We downloaded walk score for all of these study participants, and across the interquartile range for walk score, there's a little over 40% difference in physical activity. And then when we look at our new measure, which is the Walkability Index 2.0, there's just under 40% difference in physical activity across the interquartile range for our walkability measure. And you'll see that all of those confidence intervals overlap, and the point estimate from each analysis is overlapped by the confidence intervals from the other 2 analyses. So I'm feeling pretty good about this because it suggests that our new walkability index is performing at least as well as our original walkability index. It is also performing as well as walk score as a predictor of physical activity in New York City. And then going back to 1990, we've built our measure in 1990, and we've linked it to the baseline data from the NYU Women's Health Cohort. And one of the things about the NYU Women's Health Cohort is it drew women from New York City, Westchester, Connecticut, New Jersey. So it's actually the New York City metropolitan area. So now our walkability index is for 1990, but it's also no longer confined to just New York City. We can measure this anywhere where our study participants lived. And so what I've plotted here is the difference in Met hours of walking per week by quartile of walkability index across the range of walkability seen in the NYU study, adjusting for the variables that you see at the bottom. And what you see is that there's a significant association between increasing quartile of walkability and Met hours of physical activity back in 1990 in this data set. And then here I've plotted the difference in BMI by quartile. So the women provided height and weight data, and you can see that there's a significant difference in the BMI of the women when indexed against the walkability of their residential neighborhoods, adjusting for these covariates. So what we've been able to do is now measure walkability over 30 years ago using these historical data and show that in health data that's contemporaneous with those measurements, that walkability predicts physical activity and walkability predicts body mass index. So our next steps are that we're looking to recruit teams from other cities in the United States who have measured physical activity via accelerometers. And we're going to create partnerships where we will create the Neighborhood Walkability Index 2.0 for their study subjects, and jointly analyze to see how well our new measure predicts physical activity in cities across America compared to the original measures that they used. And then the second thing that we're going to do is we are working with a very, very large national cohort called the Regards cohort that has been recruiting or recruited people back in the 90s and has been following them up through to today for various health outcomes. And we are going to create annual measures of neighborhood walkability for each of the members of this cohort so that we can track neighborhood walkability through time and place in the United States with health data from cohort members attached to that data. And so we'll finally be able to have historical cohort analyses with decades of follow-up for health outcomes that we can compare to neighborhood walkability and urban design across the United States. So my conclusions are that these concepts that really came out of urban design, these concepts about how neighborhood design supports physical activity, particularly pedestrian activity, when we measure these concepts and we operationalize them and create measures that relate to these concepts, what we see is that the ideas about what supports pedestrian activity are indeed associated with greater levels of physical activity and also walking among residents who live in these neighborhoods. More generally, what we see is that the field of epidemiology is becoming ever more data intensive. So now I'm talking about using national data on every single business and establishment in the United States over a 30-year period with 50 million observations through that time period. And we're framing this as a concept of urban informatics. But really, this is just one area where information technology can be leveraged for doing population health research. And one of the things that we're learning is that when we think about spatial epidemiology, we need to balance the richness of data that is available in some municipalities at some times with the need for nationally available data that is consistently collected across space, but also across decades. And so I've had the very privileged opportunity to work in New York City with the Department of Health, where we have exquisitely detailed data about New York City over the last decade. But that data really stops at the boundaries of New York City. So when I step outside of New York City and I step into Long Island or Westchester, or I go across the river to New Jersey, what kinds of data are available to me changes radically, and how that data were collected changes radically. And so now we're putting a lot of effort into trying to come up with identifying the kinds of data that were uniformly collected through space and uniformly collected through time. And that's our big push for the future. Obviously, this is a huge team of people that worked on this over the years. We have a deep partnership with our Department of Health. Multiple epidemiologists have worked on this. We link up with environmental sciences, geography and spatial analysis, urban sociology, and we're privileged to have been funded by NIH and New York City and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And that is all I have for you guys. I'm happy to answer any questions.
So thank you so much, Dr. Rundle. It was an excellent talk and very interesting to hear. So the audience grew in the meantime, so that's also nice, and people really stick to until the end, so that's a good sign. And I want I want to urge people, if they have questions, so you can use the Q&A button and just type in the question, and I can read it out, and Andrew can read it out. In the meantime, I also have a question for you. What's your idea on the generalizability of this walkability measure? You talk about example of New York City, and how would walkability really translate to? Would it really say something also about physical activity in other cities, and maybe villages in the United States, and what about, for instance, Europe? At least, yeah. Maybe that's the first question.
Yeah. So a number of groups in the U.S. have used Lawrence Frank's measure of his original measure of walkability, and have actually found consistent results across different types of cities. So Atlanta, San Francisco, and Seattle come to mind immediately. And then there's an international collaborative project in that Jim Salas is running, looking at physical activity.
Right, yeah.
Looking at physical activity, and they are using, to the best of their ability, similar kinds of walkability measures across these various countries that are involved in their collaborative effort to see how that how walkability predicts physical activity in an international setting. And I'm not fully up to date on where his team is with their project, but I know that they're working on it. But I have seen that the original measure that Frank came up with has been used across cities. I think it's also been used in Australia with fairly consistent results.
And
our goal is to take our measure and get teams to use it and see how well it stacks up in different places, and let the data show us if it's really something that is generalizable.
Yeah, and I'll ask that also because in Europe we consider every city here to be considered to be walkable, and my feeling was when you talked about the walkability 2.0 that actually integrating destinations and walkable interesting destinations would be also maybe better also discriminating walkable neighborhoods in countries in Europe as well. In the meantime, we have a question from Luca Thornton. He asks, hi Andrew, what are your thoughts about using a tool across cities and across countries? So each local context has its own nuances, and his view is to better understand the impact of the local context. You are better off with a context-specific tool than an overall tool, and also
Yeah,
considering the social environment. That's an interesting one.
yeah. So I guess I'll take the last part first. So the last part is that, this is a purely urban planning, urban design grounded measure, right? So it doesn't take into account things like crime, litter, aesthetic issues. It doesn't take into account any of that. So in our work with regards, we're going to create separate measures that try and sort of measure these other things about the experiential aspects of walking or being a pedestrian. So yes, we're very much aware that this metric is sort of only grounded in one component of what you would think of as being supportive of walking. And then there is this tension between having something that is very locally relevant versus being uniform. And as an epidemiologist, looking to run basically, regression analyses, I need an exposure metric that is consistent or tells me something about a consistent underlying construct across locales. Otherwise, my regression coefficient has potentially built-in effect modification into their coefficient that I'm not seeing. So we've been focused on coming up with a measure that relates to the theory that is talked about in planning that we can consistently use across the United States. One of the things that we've been thinking about is sort of changes in elevation. So if you think about San Francisco or Seattle, where there's radically steep streets to climb, versus New York City, which is really, really flat. Measures of urban planning related measures may have a completely different meaning when you have very, very steep streets versus very flat streets. So this is an issue that we've, in our team meetings, have started arguing about how to incorporate or think about. It's relatively easy to create measures of steepness for every single block, but how to incorporate that into our modeling is a question that we're still sort of grappling with.
Yep. So another question from Xiaoyang Li. Hi, how do urban planners change the existing built environment to make streets more walkable? So it's supposed not to be easy to change the existing built environment?
So I don't really agree, and I have a very New York centric view of the world because I spend most of my time in New York City. But the truth is that we are tearing down and rebuilding New York City continuously, right? And we think about zoning. So we have laws around zoning, which dictate the kinds of businesses, for instance, that can be put in place in a given area. And so zoning is a tool that can be used to change land use mix, change the types of destinations that are available. We've used zoning to try and get more supermarkets into neighborhoods that don't have access to healthy food, for instance. We just opened a new subway line. I mean, it's the first new one in decades, obviously, but we pulled it off. We opened a new subway line. So yeah, we're not going to make radical changes to the street grid. But we are going to make changes to population density, and we are going to make changes to zoning that will have impacts on the built environment in the sort of dimensions we're talking about.
Right. So another other question that I was having while listening to your excellent talk is that, you show that higher walkable areas, those residents living there are also walking more and are more physically active. But isn't there some bias going on, for instance, with residential self-selection, for instance, so that people who like to walk choose to live in a neighborhood where they really can be active?
Yeah, so, and the data is cross-sectional, so that also amplifies the possibility for unseen self-selection. So I have a couple of thoughts about this. One is that in New York City, and in fact in the United States, we're a very, very segregated country. And in New York City, the primary determinants of where you can live are income, and then correlates with race and ethnicity. And so all of our analyses account for or adjust for income at the individual level and neighborhood income and race ethnicity. And I showed you a couple of slides where we didn't actually adjust for individual income because it wasn't a confounder, but all of our analyses adjust for the variables that we believe give you the ability to select where you're going to live. And so, yes, within a strata of, let's say, $50,000 or more income, there might be some variation of self-selection amongst individuals who make the same income that we're not observing and can't control for. And so this is why, in many ways, we want to go to longitudinal cohort studies where we can observe change in neighborhood or people who move from neighborhood A to neighborhood B and see what happens to them. And so, yeah, that's one of the why we've put so much effort into thinking about longitudinal measures so that we can actually see this kind of thing.
Thanks. And somewhere in the middle of your talk, this was another part of your talk. It was about the differences in the area and the size that participants utilize based on, for instance, homicide rates. But did you also look at the socio-demographic buildup of the people? For instance, that what we found in the Spotlight European study, that older people generally have a smaller activity space, or that lower educated people are also utilizing less space than higher educated people.
So the two individual level dimensions that were really important in our data were self-rated health. So it was less about age per se than self-rated health. And then the second was around the number of children that you have. So the more children you have, the more space.
Bigger,
So you got a kid, take your kid to school and play dates and so on. So I had all these theories and ideas, but it turned out it all boiled down to self-rated health and the number of kids you have.
Interesting. So maybe a final question. All the way at the beginning, you talked about web scraping tools to harvest GIS data. Can you elaborate a little bit on those tools? What are those tools?
I mean, basically, it's setting up scripts in Python to access websites that have information over and over again using different addresses or spatial coordinates, right? So you can imagine typing every address in New York City into, let's say, walkscore.com or yelp.com or wherever, or hiring an army of graduate students to do that. But that would be hugely time consuming. Or you could just write a small program that does the same thing. And so what we've done is we have created a spatial sample of New York City. So we've calculated the geographic centroid of every census block in New York City. We've sent that long and latitude up to Google's reverse geocoder to give us the physical address that is closest to that point. So now we have a database of 38,000 addresses that are evenly, more or less, spatially sampled across New York City. And we use that as a sampling frame, and then those addresses can be submitted en masse to a website and get back information about the area around those addresses. And then we have scripts that will automatically pull whatever information that we're looking for out of the web page that comes back and drop it into our database. Does that make sense?
Yeah, this makes sense. Thanks. And also adding to that, another, I think it's a suggestion and maybe something to reflect upon is Xiao Yang Li asked that Google Street View provide profile view of cityscapes. So you can walk through a city using Google Street View. And that's a very potential data source also for urban studies. And currently with the development of artificial intelligence and the increasingly availability of street level images, what do you think about Google Street View helping urban studies in the future?
We are very much into that. So we've published probably 6 to 8 papers on this topic, and we've built a system called Canvas that gives you tools to conduct neighborhood audits using Street View. And we have a paper on this topic that describes our software platform. So the software sits on top of Street View and provides a study coordinator and a viewer with lots of tools for doing this. And so we have saturation sampled for five cities now in the United States, where we've basically, again, using a spatial sampling plan, we have gone to every block in that spatial sampling plan and collected data for Detroit, New York City, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and I think it's San Jose. And then from that data have created metrics for those cities. One of the things we've looked at is neighborhood disorder. And so we've been extensively using Street View to gather data about American cities using the kind of neighborhood audit tool that you would normally use in person. We then deploy using Street View. We've been working with some computer scientists around artificial intelligence for doing automated data collection from the images. And I've seen some very poor examples of that, and I've actually seen some good examples of that. So there's a team at Columbia that can count the number of cars in an image. Yeah. So if you show them a streetscape, it'll tell you how many cars are there. And there's a team working on standing water, so having an algorithm that can detect pools of standing water in an image. And this is sort of relevant to mosquitoes and Zika, obviously. And they haven't used it with Street View, but they've downloaded libraries of photos from Google Images and trained a neural network to hunt for standing water. So
that's very interesting. And also Google is ahead on this topic, I think, to recognize images, for instance, of trees and of others. So that right. in some near future, that should be able to be combined and then have this automated tool, so you won't need any graduate students anymore to assess the street level. So so Xiaoyang Li said she's from MIT, and they actually are doing it while we talk. The future has begun. If there's no more pressing questions and issues that need to be answered before we come to an end here, I would like to thank you once more, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you for setting this up and inviting me.
Yeah, it is an excellent lecture, and I thank all the participants that are still there. And with this, we come to a close. I wish you a good night, good morning, and goodbye to the next webinar. All right.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.